The Ahmed Kathrada Foundation Executive Director, Neeshan Balton, also joining us for more of that reaction. Neeshan, good to have you, and thank you very much for coming on this evening. The President saying, well, look, we are giving you broad strokes of the plan for the next 5 years. We are still committed to the agenda of the National Development Plan 2030 vision. This is going to be our blueprint. This is what's going to drive our economic growth and so on and so forth. And right towards the tail end, he says, I know people across society are committed to this idea of the national dialogue. We are still going to have that. Many are asking, so what are we going to be talking about at the national dialogue if you've already told us what your goals are, what you've budgeted for, and what you're going to be doing in the next 5 years?
Thank you for the opportunity. I think we must start off with what I think is coming through the speech is that the problems of South Africa are so huge that government on its own is not going to solve it. And in order to then bring in those who are outside of the party political space and who are outside of the GNU, broadly civil society and everybody else, they need to come in some way to reaffirm the 2030 National Development Plan or in its amended form and begin to unpack the 3 priority areas here. And importantly then, understand what are the deliverables, what are the roles and responsibilities, and most importantly, what are the accountability mechanisms, not only for government, but for business, for civil society, for labor, and for everybody else. Because this comes within a context of a decline in democratic support in South Africa that we've seen over the last 30 years, with the first time ever the significant bigger numbers of people who haven't taken up the option to vote, who opted out of the system. And that is the first indicator of a democracy that now needs to be reset. And it's within that context that I think you and perhaps others need to see the value of a properly structured national dialogue that is not a once-off event. If this dialogue is set up properly, it has the accountability mechanisms, it has the report back mechanisms over the next 5 years, then the performance agreements of ministers would feature in some of those discussions. Yeah. You know, the transparency of government performance information would come into those discussions. But likewise, society will have to say what is its role to prevent the destruction of infrastructure across the length and breadth of the country, and what we can and should be doing in that regard as well.
So a commitment made that we will professionalize the public service. We're not really told how, except to say we're going to try and attract into the state, as you've mentioned, people with skills, people with integrity, but also people with capabilities. How do you think, I mean, as the national dialogue would sit, that particular aspect should be fleshed out?
I think I'm so thrilled that this is the sort of the anchor pillar to the 3 priorities that were mentioned. Because if we don't get the 1 million+ public servants to do the work that they are paid to do in the manner that is expected from them, and we have the most capable and competent people there, none of the other priorities, in fact, have a chance of seeing the light of day. There is draft legislation currently on the table in Parliament, or the NCOP, and it is within that legislation that I think key areas of professionalization come in. Importantly is this point of separating out the political interference aspect, which this speech refers to, but which has been a fundamental problem that has created the loopholes for state capture in our country. Then I think there's more work that will have to be done about who do you attract into the public service, how do people in fact join the public service, what are the minimum requirements, and it's within that framework that there is a professionalization framework that is now on the table for discussion. So I think the basics are there. The discussions around that need to take place. The formalization of the legislation has to take place. And then it's for implementation and oversight by the Public Service Commission and by Parliament itself.
The approach that the government says it will take of establishing a state-owned SOE holding company, do you think that will give greater capacity, but will give greater transparency, better governance, and ability to exercise oversight?
I think it has possibilities of doing that. This legislation was, if I'm right, was very rushed in the last closing weeks of Parliament. It needs to be better understood. The mechanics of this needs to be better understood. But from what I understand is that there are underperforming state-owned companies and other SOEs that will be looked at properly. And if they don't add value, they might in fact be done away with. Then there are those that are transferred back to ministries and departments that have direct oversight now. And those who really add value to the country in terms of its development objectives, but are also financially sustainable. What I got from the speech is that their revenue gains or their profits goes into something called a sovereign fund, which essentially means that you really want SOEs to work like companies, to make a profit, and the profits that they make then helps the development agenda of the country. So in theory, it sounds fine. Again, it has to deal with the practicalities, the right people in the job, the right boards to do the oversight work. And then the overarching structure that now resides within the presidency is going to have one huge mammoth task to drive this new entity. And we would need to understand the details as they unfold over the next few months.
Having had the president give the address, having seen the new ministers here and there, even before 100 days beginning to function in their offices, do you get a sense that they understand and they recognize this view that the president expressed, that we need some overriding commitment to a joint national effort?
I get that sense. But I also realize that all of these parties are going to have to contest the 2026 elections. And they now find themselves in a position where they have to work together, but also know that they are going to have to compete against each other, both in 2026 and 2029. So it's a balancing act that I think will alter their characters, but will also alter the character of our politics fundamentally. I think from society, outside of political parties, we must just demand the best from all of them that is in the interest of the country, and applaud when they do the right things that move in that direction, and call them out immediately when they don't. As the minister in the presidency erroneously tried to blame the voters for the bloated cabinet. And I thought people in the country let her have their views about that being the wrong thing to be saying at this point in time. And you've seen the same things with members, particularly of the DA, trying to present themselves as DA ministers, claiming credit for things, being called out immediately, and saying that they were really ministers of the government of national unity and not their parties there. So that tension between party interests and national interests is something they are all going to have to learn and develop a way of working. And I'm sure that will come over time, because this is something that I think none of them have been prepared for.
Growth and economic development, certainly one would say, has been a major focus of the president's speech, looking at interventions at local government, strengthening capacity there, ensuring oversight is there, even looking at the structure of how local governments are set up and financed. But the advancing of social justice is one where maybe we can pin a question on, looking at the three priorities. Do you think it's said enough? Do you see social justice being advanced there in those three priorities?
Well, I think social justice, as it relates to tackling unemployment, poverty, the high cost of living, providing efficient and effective services through a capable state, are all linked to issues of social justice. I think they hint there about the SRD grant moving to perhaps, and they don't use the word of a basic income grant, but the intention is there.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I think we, as Matthew Parks and I think others were saying tonight, there's a range of progressive policy direction shifts here that we just need to understand the detail as the ministers now begin to flesh out the detail. And I'm sure that the debates, I'm not sure if there is a debate on this speech, but over the next few weeks, the details of this will come. But more importantly, Thabo, is that what we have here is the framework for a plan that will really crystallize around October when the next 5-year development plan gets finalized. And around that's where I think a lot of the detail of this is what we are going to have to find ways of checking and influencing where there are areas of weakness.
So what you've just said now with, of course, the outlining and the fleshing out, which we are likely going to hear from the Minister of Finance in his budget, brought me to this point that the President raised in his speech. We will manage public finances with a view of stabilizing debt. We are firmly committed to steadily reducing the cost of servicing of debt so that we can redirect funds towards other critical social and economic needs. I mean, you would read that and think it's direct cut and paste from the speech of the Minister of Finance. And Labour and other sectors of society will look at that and say, well, this means that this government is going to continue with the austerity measures. And there are some, even in civil society, who have said this has had some detrimental effect because budgets have been cut left, right, and centre, especially in social services, in education, and in policing, even in some instances.
I hold a slightly different view. I think that the discussion we're not having in the country is what do we do when you have limited resources? Where do you allocate those resources? And what do you expect as return from those allocations? So when people say that X, Y, or Z deserves more money, I think it's also important that they start to say where that money should come from and from which particular departments it must be cut. Because there isn't an endless supply of resources, which I think is what was alluded to here. That if we have a set of priorities, and again, that's where the national dialogue and the compact comes in, because we would need to agree that these are the priorities and this is where resources will be directed to, and these are the outcomes that we would be working towards. And then begin to, once we agree on that, then we cannot be having these kinds of after budget that comes via the media or ministers and others complaining about lack of budgets, when in fact trade-offs well before the next 5-year plan is finalized. I think, secondly, there's a lot of unspent money in government. You see that annually across. And those get returned to National Treasury. And we need to understand why that is the case and how that reprioritization needs to happen. But if there's agreement on a set of basic priorities that South Africans need in order to survive, which I think is alluded to in the speech, then it's a case of seeing what the budget and the forthcoming budgets are going to do in terms of what the resources are that's allocated. If those resources don't meet the commitment, then I think government has to be called out.
Yeah, indeed. Neeshan, let me appreciate you. Thank you very much for coming on, Executive Director for the Ahmed Kathrada Foundation. They're reacting to the opening of Parliament address.